Today we have another great story for you. Toe wishes you a wonderful experience. I suspected my wife was planning a divorce, so I moved my assets. 2 weeks later she filed and said it had all been a joke. Hi friends, I've been scrolling through posts here for a while, always thinking I'd never have my own story to share. But life has a way of surprising you. I've been carrying this for months. I need to let it out. Let me tell you from the beginning. I've never been the type to jump to conclusions or assume the worst. My wife, let's call her M, and I have been together for 6 years, married for 3. Things were good, or so I thought. We had the usual ups and downs, sure, but nothing that made me think, oh, there's trouble here. In fact, for most of our relationship we were that couple. Partners till the end. We laughed at silly inside jokes, debated which movie to watch for hours, and had a routine that just worked. She planned elaborate dates, and I surprised her with her favorite takeout after a long day. Everything felt effortless, like we cracked this whole love thing. That's why what happened next hit me like a ton of bricks. A few months ago things started to change. At first they were small things you probably would have missed if you weren't paying attention. She started carrying her phone everywhere, even if she was just going to the kitchen or folding laundry. Before that, her phone would just sit on the coffee table for hours, and she wouldn't care who touched it. One day I made a joke saying, "You running a secret spy network now?" She laughed and said, "No, work's been sending me a lot of emails." Okay, fine. But then a couple of days later she set up a passcode, which surprised me because she'd never used one before. I casually asked her why, and she said something vague about security and hackers. I didn't push it because I didn't want to sound paranoid, but something about it felt off. It didn't stop there. She started leaving the room to take calls, something she never did before. And it wasn't subtle. Her phone would ring and she'd say, "Oh, let me take this quick," and disappear into the bedroom or step out onto the porch. If I asked who it was, she'd just say, "Just a friend from work." Then she adopted this habit of keeping her phone face down on the table. I didn't even realize it was a thing until one day I leaned over to hand her something, and she quickly moved her phone out of the way. It was one of those blink and you'll miss it moments, but it stuck with me. It wasn't just the phone thing though. She started feeling distant. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt like I was pulling teeth. If I mentioned plans for the future, like where we should go for our anniversary or, "Do you think we should start saving for a new car?" she'd just nod and say, "Yeah, we'll see," before changing the subject. The day it all really clicked for me was a random Wednesday. She told me she was meeting a friend for coffee after work. Didn't seem unusual. She does that sometimes. I was running some errands in the same area, so I thought, why not surprise her? It'll be cute. When I arrived though, she wasn't with her friend. She was outside the cafe, pacing back and forth with her phone glued to her ear. I stayed in my car because something about the way she was talking seemed serious. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but I heard snippets like, "It's almost ready," and "starting over soon." My stomach sank. I couldn't make out what she meant, but it didn't sound like work stuff or friend drama. It sounded bigger than that, like it was something she'd been planning. When she got home later, I asked how her coffee date went, trying to keep my tone relaxed. She gave me this whole story about her friend venting about her boyfriend's latest blunder. She went on and on about how she was giving her advice and being a good listener. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but my mind was working overtime. Was I reading too much into this, or was something deeper going on? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something she wasn't telling me. Things continued like this for a few more days. I started observing her behavior more closely. Not because I wanted to catch her at something, but because I needed to understand what I'd seen and heard. She wasn't acting suspicious in a big, obvious way, but it was the small things that didn't add up. And then, out of the blue, she mentioned our finances. We were having dinner one night, just a regular weeknight meal. We were sitting there, chatting about random stuff, her work, a new show I wanted to watch, when she said, "You know, we should really organize all our financial stuff." With her most innocent smile. It was such a random comment that I just stared at her for a second. "What do you mean?" I asked. She shrugged. "I just think we should have everything in one place, you know? All our account info, passwords, documents, that kind of thing. Just in case there's an emergency." I didn't know what to say. We'd never talked about this before, and the timing felt weird considering everything else I'd been noticing. "What kind of emergency?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She shrugged again. Just being smart. What if something happens to one of us? Or if we need to make a big financial decision quickly? Her explanation made sense on the surface, but something in the way she said it made me uneasy. It was too rehearsed, too tidy, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. I nodded and mumbled, but alarms were going off in my head. Why now? Why was she suddenly concerned about organizing our finances when we'd always kept things separate and loose? That night, my mind kept replaying her comment over and over, trying to piece things together and see what it could mean. Was this just normal adulting and I was overreacting? But then I thought about the phone calls, the conversation I'd overheard at the cafe, and how distant she'd been lately. It all started to click, and I didn't like the picture it was painting. I still didn't do anything about it. A couple of days later, she brought it up again. We were in the kitchen. I was making a sandwich and she was checking her phone when she suddenly said, "Have you thought more about organizing the bank stuff? You know, where all the account details are." I put down the knife and turned to her. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone relaxed but firm. "You've mentioned the finances a lot lately. Is there something we need to talk about?" She finally looked up from her phone, surprised, like she wasn't expecting me to press her. No, nothing's going on," she said quickly, letting out a small laugh. "I just think it's important, that's all. You know, in case of an emergency." "What kind of emergency?" I asked again. She shrugged, her face impossible to read. "I don't know, life stuff. It's nothing serious, I promise. I just think it's something we should be on top of." Her answer felt vague, too vague. I nodded and dropped the subject, but the way she avoided giving a straight answer only fueled my suspicion. It didn't sound like a casual suggestion anymore. It felt like she was hiding something, and I had no idea what it was. The next day, while she was at work, I decided to take a closer look at our financial situation. I opened our joint online account and noticed something odd. A few small transfers had been made over the past month. Nothing huge, just small amounts that didn't seem to have a clear purpose. They weren't labeled as bill payments or grocery shopping or anything like that. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it looked like she'd been moving money out of the account for something, and I couldn't figure out what. I thought about confronting her, but something told me to wait. If I was wrong, I'd look like an idiot, and if I was right, well, I needed to be cautious. But it was eating me alive. So, I contacted someone I trusted, an old friend from college who happens to be a lawyer. I explained what I'd noticed, trying not to sound like a paranoid conspiracy theorist. "Look," he said after I'd explained everything, "I'm not saying anything is going on, but you're not crazy for wanting to be prepared. If you're worried about protecting your assets, now's the time to do it. Better safe than sorry." He gave me a rundown of what I could do. A few simple steps to ensure my finances were protected in case something was up. I admit, the idea of taking such action felt extreme. It felt like I was plotting something terrible when I wasn't even sure there was something wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to. If she really was doing something and I was starting to believe she was, I needed to protect myself. It wasn't an easy decision. This wasn't just about money or assets, though. It was about the life we'd built together. I kept flashing back to memories: our wedding day, the times we stayed up late talking about our dreams, those random little jokes we shared. How did we get here? Was this all that was left of our marriage? The thought of taking those steps felt like admitting defeat, like I was somehow giving up on the trust we once had. That night, while she was out, I sat at my desk and pulled out my laptop. My hands were shaking as I opened the browser and began reviewing everything: bank accounts, investment accounts, the deed to the house. Every document I reviewed felt like a betrayal. But the nagging voice in my head kept reminding me that this was about survival, not sabotage. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't act now, I'd regret it later. I made a list of everything I could transfer and how to do it without raising suspicion. As I typed, I felt a crushing weight on my chest. I'd trusted her completely for years, and now here I was playing defense against the person I thought would always be on my side. Then I called my mom. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to explain why I needed her help. "I need you to hold on to some things for me for a while. It's nothing bad, just something I need to do, to protect myself just in case." She was quiet for a moment, probably trying to understand what I wasn't saying. "Are you okay?" Her voice was full of concern. "Yeah, Elite. It's just a precaution. Nothing to worry about." She didn't push it, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she said, "Sure, honey. Whatever you need." I hung up the phone feeling a strange mix of relief and shame. I hated involving her in this mess, but at the same time, knowing she had my back gave me a sense of stability in a situation that felt like quicksand. By the time Em got home, I'd already started the process. I transferred the majority of my assets, our savings, my investments, even the house, all into my mother's name. I left enough in our joint account to keep up appearances, but the rest was secured. She didn't notice anything. She came in, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I acted normal, but inside I was a mess. Part of me felt guilty, like I was betraying her trust, but another part of me felt relieved, like I was finally taking control of a situation that was spiraling out of my hands. For the next few days, I tried to keep things as normal as possible. I didn't want to give her any indication that something had changed. She seemed determined, even unusually cheerful at times, but instead of reassuring me, it made me even more suspicious. If she was planning something, she was doing it expertly, hiding it well. The thing that stood out the most was that she didn't mention finances again, not once after I questioned her the last time. It was like the topic had vanished completely from her mind. I thought maybe I'd overreacted and that she'd dropped the subject because it really wasn't that important. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like she was avoiding it. Again, after I pressed her, I caught her glancing at me sideways a few times, quick looks as if she were gauging my mood or deciding whether she should say something. Each time I noticed it, she'd immediately turn her attention back to whatever she was doing, the TV, a book. It was subtle, but it was there. It felt like she was waiting for me to bring the topic up, like she didn't want to risk touching it again. The silence on the subject only made me more uneasy. It wasn't like her to drop something she considered important, and the way she avoided it now felt deliberate. If she was testing the waters, she wasn't getting in. And if she was waiting for something, I wasn't going to give her the green light. Whatever her next move was, I knew I had to stay one step ahead. Something was coming, I just didn't know when or how. All I could do was prepare. That night, I double-checked everything with my lawyer, making sure it was airtight and couldn't be contested. I even called my mom to confirm she had all the documentation on her end. 2 weeks passed and everything seemed normal. Too normal, actually. She was acting more affectionate, even initiating conversations about random things like work or what we should have for dinner. It was throwing me off because for months she'd been distant, avoiding any topic deeper than small talk. Part of me started to wonder if I'd been overreacting this whole time. Maybe the odd behavior was just stress or something I couldn't understand. But then, one random Friday night, she sat down on the couch, turned off the TV and said, "We need to talk." My stomach dropped instantly. I knew what was coming, even before she said it. "I think we should get a divorce," she said, her tone so calm it sounded rehearsed. She wasn't angry or emotional. She was just cold, like she was telling me we were out of milk. I looked at her, not knowing what to say, while she launched into her reasons. She talked about needing space, wanting to find herself, feeling like she'd lost her identity in the marriage, common breakup lines that didn't really explain anything. But then she said something that hit me in a different way. "You know, I've made a lot of sacrifices for you over the years, and I don't think you really appreciate them. I deserve more." That last part stung. It wasn't just that she wanted out. It was that she was framing it as if I owed her something, as if this was all my fault and she was simply reclaiming what was rightfully hers. I sat there trying to process what she was saying, but a new question kept bubbling up in my mind. Why now? Then she dropped a line that made everything start clicking into place. "A friend of mine has been helping me see things more clearly," she said, without looking me in the eye. A friend. I stayed silent, letting her talk, but my mind was racing. Who was this friend? Why were they involved in my marriage? The way she said it wasn't casual. It sounded like someone had been encouraging her, convincing her that leaving me wasn't just an option, but some sort of strategy she needed to carry out. And the more she talked about what she deserved more for her sacrifices, the harder it was to believe what I was hearing. Sacrifices? What sacrifices? She had always seemed happy with me, or at least that's what she always said. I worked hard to give her the life she wanted, and I didn't just mean financially. When she wanted to move closer to her work, I agreed, even though it meant a longer commute for me. When she wanted to go to that expensive yoga retreat last year, I made sure it happened. I supported her when she switched careers twice, telling her it was okay to take that leap because I wanted her to be happy. I thought being a good husband meant putting her first whenever I could. And it wasn't like I was some distant, unattentive partner. I was present. I remembered anniversaries and those little things she'd mentioned liking. I planned romantic dates when she said she was feeling stuck in a rut. I listened to her vent about work, about her friends, about her family. I didn't always get it right, but I always tried. That's what made the "I deserve more" line sting so much. I didn't believe it for a second. She wasn't unhappy because of anything I had done or failed to do. She was unhappy because something had changed in her. Maybe it was this friend she kept talking about. Maybe it was something else. But the person sitting in front of me wasn't the woman I'd married. And I wasn't going to let her rewrite our history. In that moment, I simply nodded and said something neutral like, "If that's how you feel, I guess we should figure out what the next steps are." She seemed surprised that I wasn't arguing or begging her to stay, but I didn't care. My focus had shifted. I needed to know who or what was behind this calculated shift in her behavior. This wasn't just a sudden epiphany that she wanted out. This was something bigger. And I wasn't going to let her catch me off guard for a second longer. After that conversation, she moved out to her own apartment. And by Monday, she had the divorce papers served. And let me tell you, they weren't just about ending the relationship. It was about taking everything: half the house, my savings, my investments, the car. She wanted it all, plus some vague clause about spousal support, which made no sense given her decent salary. It was like she was aiming for the moon, expecting me to roll over and hand her everything I'd worked for. At first, I thought she was just being vindictive, but the way she'd laid out her demands, so detailed and aggressive, made me think there was definitely someone guiding her through this whole thing. So, I started investigating. It's not like I could just ask her who she'd been talking to, so I had to get creative. I started with her social media. She hadn't blocked me, and while she didn't post much, I went through the photos she was tagged in and the comments, looking for anyone new. That's when I noticed a pattern. Someone named Jack kept liking and commenting on her posts. It wasn't anything inappropriate, just enough to make me wonder. I clicked on his profile and it was public. At first glance, it didn't seem like much. A guy in his 30s who worked in marketing, according to his bio. But as I kept scrolling, I noticed something odd. He'd posted a photo at the same cafe I'd seen her at weeks earlier, the same day I'd overheard her talking about starting over. My stomach flipped. As I scrolled further through his profile, there were more subtle clues. A comment on one of her posts saying, "You got this," and a selfie he'd posted from what looked like her new apartment. It wasn't concrete proof, but it was enough to make me feel suspicious. I didn't know what to do with that information, but I knew I couldn't sit around waiting for answers to fall into my lap. The mention of a friend who was helping her with all this kept sticking with me, and I needed to know who it was. I decided to call a mutual friend of ours, Lisa. She and my wife had been close for years, so if anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. At first, I kept the conversation casual, just asking if she'd talked to my wife recently or noticed anything unusual. Lisa responded quickly, saying she didn't know anything about any friend or advice. I asked a couple more questions, trying to probe delicately, but she shut the conversation down defensively, saying she really couldn't help. The whole thing felt rushed, like she was trying to avoid getting involved. Unwilling to give up, I called another friend, Amy. I followed the same protocol, explaining that I was just trying to understand what was going on. At first, she seemed hesitant, dodging my questions with vague answers. When I pushed a little harder, she abruptly ended the call, leaving me more suspicious than ever. I sat there frustrated, trying to figure out what my next move should be. Then, to my surprise, Amy called me back. She told me she needed to make sure what she told me wouldn't get back to my wife. I promised it wouldn't, and after a long pause, she finally told me what she knew. Apparently, my wife had been spending a lot of time with someone named Jack, someone she'd met at work. Amy said she didn't know much more, but from what she'd heard, Jack was deeply involved in the advice my wife was getting about the divorce. Hearing that name felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. It was clear now that this wasn't just about her wanting space or finding herself. There was another person in the equation guiding her decisions, and I was determined to find out why. I decided to confront it in my own way. That weekend, I drove to his apartment building and parked a block away, waiting to confirm what I already knew. Sure enough, a couple of hours later, she walked out of the building, accompanied by Jack. They weren't holding hands or anything, but the way they walked together so close, talking in each other's ears, was enough. They got into his car and drove off, leaving me sitting there staring at the spot where they'd been. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. At that point, it was clear she hadn't just fallen for someone else. She'd been planning her exit, with someone else's help. And now, everything made sense: the sudden distance, the questions about the finances, the aggressive demands in the divorce papers. She wasn't just leaving me. She was leaving me high and dry, and she had someone backing her up every step of the way. That night I drove home, my head a whirlwind, processing everything I'd discovered. The betrayal hurt, but what hurt more was how calculated it all had been. She was using the divorce as a springboard to the life she was building with Jack. But she had no idea what I'd set in motion. The first mediation session was tense from the moment we walked in. Her lawyer showed up with a file so thick, it looked like they were suing a Fortune 500 company. She started going through her demands like they were perfectly reasonable: half the house, the savings, my investments, the car, even pushing that added bit about spousal support. I stayed quiet, pretending to listen, but I was waiting for my lawyer to make his move. When it was finally our turn, he calmly slid a stack of documents across the table. "Before we proceed, I think it's important for everyone to review these," my lawyer said. Hers took the papers, skimming them quickly. Her confident demeanor changed instantly as she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing deeper with each turn. "What is this?" she asked, looking up. "These documents show the transfer of all major assets to a trust in the name of my client's mother," my lawyer explained, his voice firm. "The transfers were completed several weeks before the divorce filing, and the trust is completely legal and irrevocable." The room went absolutely silent. Her lawyer turned to her, his confusion now mixed with frustration. "You didn't mention this," he said flatly. She snatched the papers from his hands, scanning them quickly, her face flushing. "This can't be real," she muttered, staring at the notarized signatures and dates. Then she turned to me, her expression shifting from disbelief to fury. "You planned this," she hissed, looking at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. "You knew I was going to file and set this up to spite me." I didn't respond. I just sat there, letting her connect the dots on her own. Her lawyer, visibly flustered, asked my lawyer to explain further. So he did, calmly, meticulously, with all the necessary proof to make the transfers irrefutable. The dates matched up perfectly, showing I had moved everything well before she filed. The signatures were properly notarized, and the trust was bulletproof. There was nothing they could do to challenge it. She was livid. "You are unbelievable," she exclaimed, leaning forward in her chair. "I can't believe you would do this to me." I still didn't say a word. What was I going to say? This wasn't about what I'd done to her. It was about protecting myself because she had made it clear she wasn't going to go quietly. The meeting ended with her lawyer muttering something about needing to reevaluate their approach, but it was obvious to everyone in the room that they no longer had any plays to make. As we were leaving the building, she pulled me aside in the hallway, her face a mix of rage and desperation. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "You're going to regret this." I just looked at her and replied, "I already regret trusting you. That's the only regret I have." After that mediation session, things unraveled faster than I expected. She went into crisis mode almost immediately. It started with the calls, endless calls. At first, she sounded calm, even apologetic, leaving voicemails that began with, "I think we just need to talk," or, "I know this has gotten messy, but we can fix it." When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. By day 2, her messages swung between pleading and screaming. One voicemail had her crying, saying she'd made a mistake and didn't want to lose everything we'd built together. The next was a furious rant, accusing me of being stingy and vindictive, blaming me for everything wrong in her life. I ignored it all. My lawyer had advised me not to engage, and honestly, I didn't want to. I was done playing her games. But she wasn't. When the calls and texts didn't work, she started spinning stories. I started hearing from mutual friends that she'd been saying the divorce wasn't real, that it had all been an elaborate joke. A joke? Who would even believe that? It didn't take long before the cracks in her story started to show. Friends began asking questions like, "If it's a joke, why did you file actual legal documents? Why hire a lawyer and make such specific demands if it wasn't serious?" When people didn't immediately buy her joke excuse, she doubled down. She insisted it wasn't just a joke, but a way to test the strength of our relationship. She started painting herself as the victim, saying she felt hurt and betrayed by my reaction, that I'd taken things too far and destroyed the trust in our marriage. First, some people seemed to believe her stories. I got weird texts or comments from acquaintances saying things like, "Wow, I didn't realize things were that bad for her." Or even her brother being upset, saying, "You should have talked to her instead of being so drastic." It was frustrating, but I knew the truth would come out eventually. And it did, thanks to one of our mutual friends. Let's call him Matt. Matt and I weren't that close, but we'd always been cordial to each other. A couple weeks after the mediation, he texted me out of the blue, saying he had something I needed to see. When we met up, he pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages between her and Jack. First, I was confused. "How did you get these?" I asked as I scrolled through the messages. Matt explained that he had a mutual friend with Jack, someone who'd been privy to their conversations. Apparently, this mutual friend started getting uncomfortable with how things were unfolding, especially when Jack started bragging about how he was helping my wife secure her future. It wasn't long before that mutual friend connected the dots and realized what secure her future really meant, trying to bleed me dry financially. Feeling guilty for staying silent, the friend took screenshots of the messages and shared them with Matt, knowing he had a better relationship with me and could warn me. "This guy has been playing both sides," Matt said, shaking his head. "He's been influencing her to take everything from you, while making her believe he'd be there for her." Then Matt handed me the messages. "I thought you should know. You don't deserve this, man." The messages were brutal. She wasn't just venting to Jack about the divorce. She was actively planning her next steps with him, and he was guiding her through it all. One of her messages said, "Once the settlement goes through, we'll have everything we need. I just need him to agree to the terms." Jack's reply, "Don't back down. Make him feel guilty if you have to. He owes you. We'll start fresh when you have the money." I stared at Matt's phone, trying to process what I was reading. This wasn't a misunderstanding or some emotional reaction to a failing marriage. This was cold, calculated manipulation. I thanked Matt and left, but my mind kept spinning. Now it all made sense. Her sudden distance, her obsession with our finances, her aggressive demands in the divorce, it had all been part of a plan. One that she had been executing with Jack in secret. The messages spread like wildfire among our mutual friends. Matt shared them with a few people, and from there they took off. Suddenly, her narrative no longer made sense. The people who were previously neutral or even supportive started to back away. And the shift was almost immediate. The people who were defending her or who had been on the fence now saw her for who she really was. Even her closest allies started to distance themselves. When the divorce was finalized, she had nothing but her personal belongings. Her lawyer quietly dropped her case, realizing there were no legal grounds to pursue. All those bold demands crumbled under the weight of the documents I had prepared, and the trust I'd created with my mom was untouchable. As for Jack, he seemed to have vanished the moment everything started falling apart. I wouldn't be surprised if he had been using her as much as she was using him. From what I could piece together, he'd been feeding her illusions of independence and a fresh start, but the moment it became clear she wasn't going to walk away with anything, he disappeared. She spiraled. The calls and messages kept coming, but now they were more desperate. She wasn't accusing me anymore. She was pleading. "Can we talk? Please. I'll do anything to fix this." In one of the voicemails she said, "You don't have to forgive me, but can't we at least work this out and move on? I'll drop everything if you'll just talk to me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The damage was done and there was no going back. Even her family started pulling away. Her brother contacted me at one point, apologizing for some of the things he'd said earlier when he believed her version of the story. "I didn't know what she was doing to you," he admitted. "I'm sorry I believed her." As for me, I kept the house, my savings, and something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace of mind. My mom, as always, has been my rock. She came over with buckets of paint and a list of ideas to help me reclaim the space as my own. Life feels like it's finally mine again. I no longer have to second-guess every little interaction. I no longer feel betrayed. Just peace. She's a chapter in my past, one I no longer reread.